This is the first video in the Charlotte County Archives Winter Speaker Series, where we will be interviewing Mary Conley about her experiences researching her grandfather, Alexander Grant.
To get started, I'm just going to ask you to introduce yourself and to tell us a little bit about the book that you wrote with your cousin Stephen.
Okay, well, my name is Mary Conley, and I'm from St. Andrews, New Brunswick. And I was a family doctor here in Victoria for 28 years. And since I've retired, I've written two books, one about my grandfather Conley and one about my grandfather Grant. And they're both at the archives in Charlotte County.
So the title about your grandfather Grant, about the book for your grandfather Grant, is A Wild Journey with Our Grandfather. So what led you to this journey? How did you get started?
A year ago, I opened up my Facebook page and there was a picture of my grandfather Grant, and I was so surprised. Who would have a picture of him? And I'd never seen this picture before. And it was the Charlotte County Archives. So I contacted them and I found out not only did they have pictures, but they had his day-to-day diary of his time in the trenches during World War I. And so they copied it and sent it to me. I read it and I was astounded. I didn't know these things happened to him. So I contacted my cousin Stephen Grant, and the two of us decided this should be written down and, for our relatives in the future. So that's why we wrote the book. And once we got into it, we decided we better find out other things about him. We knew he was in the Boer War. He went to India. Then he came to Canada, became a minister, and then he went to the First World War. When he came back, he had PTSD. He abandoned the family and lived on and off the street for the rest of his life. That's what we knew about him. But you see, there was a whole other part to this story. And the family had written him off because all they thought was he abandoned the family. But you see, he was so tortured from the war that he really couldn't cope with anything. So we thought we'd research the whole thing. We had a wonderful winter actually doing this. And that's how the book came to be.
What was that process like? You mentioned that you spent the winter kind of researching into him. You found the photograph in the diary here at the Charlotte County Archives. Can you tell us a little bit more about what that whole process was like?
Well, yes, they also had 3 volumes written by him, and it was about the Bible. I had them sent to Stephen, and he noticed there were some dates and initials on it, and he discovered it was from the Bible Institute in Glasgow. And so Alex spent 3 years studying the Bible in Glasgow. And then Stephen found him on the ship's log that brought him to Canada. He was a missionary in Northern Ontario. And then he went to Winnipeg to the Manitoba College and spent another 3 years studying theology. And he became a Presbyterian minister with his own church in Northern Ontario again. And by this time, he'd married my grandmother and had 2 children. And then he joined, just 5 months later, he joined up and went to France, to the war. And he was there for 9 months in the trenches. So that was what we found out.
I noticed there's a map, one of the maps in your book, right in the middle. Right when he was talking about one of the towns where he walked through and it had been all bombed out, but that there were still people living in that town.
Yes.
Yeah.
Pardon me?
Sorry. Were there other details from his experience in the war that stood out to you?
Oh, I had no idea. I thought I knew about World War I, but I didn't. When he first went there, it was sort of like going to a Y camp. He'd be in the trench for 24 hours, then he'd go into town and buy souvenirs and have tea and all this. And I thought, oh, seems to be pretty laid back. And then he went to the Somme, and it was just terrible. The water, he had to carry a shovel with him so he could dig himself out of the mud. He was scared to go to sleep because the rats were just everywhere, and they were huge. He said they were as big as cats, you know, and the constant noise from the bombs. It was 24 hours a day. He thought he might go deaf. So I can understand why his nerves were shot when he came home. I mean, it was horrendous. And the only reason why he quit the war was he fell and he hurt his knee, and he tore the ligament in his knee. And it was only after he was in the hospital for that they realized that he was shell shocked, as they said. So even when he came home to New Brunswick, he was going all around southwestern New Brunswick trying to recruit people to go to the war, which is astounding to me after this terrible ordeal. But anyway, that's who he was. You know, he was very passionate about his life, and I appreciated that.
Yeah, it's very interesting after everything that he went through that he was still encouraging others to go over and do their part.
Yes.
And you mentioned when he joined up as well that he was a minister and he had a wife and 2 young kids. What do you think led him to join the war at that stage in his life?
Well, I think he was getting letters from his 2 brothers. They had joined up. And you have to realize at the time there was enthusiasm in Canada for people to go overseas and do their duty, you know. And they didn't think the war was going to last very long. They didn't realize it was going to last that long. And he'd already been a soldier, you know. He was in the Boer War and he was in India. And I think he was into adventure, you know. I read his letter that he wrote home, the last one he wrote home from Canada. And it kind of mentioned that the people in the town where he was were snobs and they weren't friendly. And I think he was disappointed about, you know, his position, and he was craving adventure. So he took off. He felt it was his duty. So.
Why did you think that it was important to share his story in a book?
At the archives about 15 years ago, and I asked to see the folder on the Conley family.
Yeah.
And there was virtually nothing in there. And I thought, I thought the archives just had this information like by magic. And then I realized it was really the family's responsibility to tell their story and put it in the archives. So that's why I wrote the 2 books, you see. So now when you go to the archives and ask for the Conley family, the Grant family, the story is there. So I feel I've done my duty.
Right. And I just wanted to touch on something you've mentioned a couple times as we've been talking. You said that your family didn't really talk about your grandfather because of his mental illness and how he had abandoned his family. And how do you think that's changed now with the research that you've done into him and what you've shared with them?
Well, yes, you see, at the time it was a huge embarrassment to mental illness was considered, you know, a failure of a person at the beginning of the last century. And they didn't really have good treatment for it either. So it was one of those things you know, swept under the carpet. And I think our understanding of mental illness has improved enormously since then. Yes, and I know Stephen and I both feel compassion for this poor man who suffered so in his last year. Yeah, we really do. And you know, it was so bad in the family, they didn't even put his name on the gravestone. And Stephen and I did that. And then Stephen arranged through the government to have, you see, Alex is buried in a pauper's grave in Montreal. And Stephen arranged to have a gravestone put on his grave there. So anyway, he's now part of the family.
Well, that's lovely.
Yeah.
That's really lovely. It's quite amazing that all of that has come from a photograph that you saw on Facebook.
That's true. Yeah, that's true.
So is there anything else that you wanted to add or anything else that you want to share about your experiences with all of this?
No, I think I should, I really want people to know that you just can't go to the archives and your family history is there. You have to contribute to the archives if you want your family history to live on to the next generations. So I would encourage people to do their own genealogy and to write their own story. That's what I think.
Lovely. Well, thank you very much for your time today and for sharing your story.
Well, thank you for asking.
Well, thank you very much.
Bye for now.